This is lecture 12.2 for Psych 440, Transfer of Training. And in this lecture, our main objective is to explain what transfer of training is, why it's so very important, and then discuss some of the individual and contextual factors that make transfer of training more or less likely. So across all of these things, we want to figure out what can we do to set up our training to maximize training transfer. Transfer of training is defined as the degree to which the employee is going to take what they learned in training and actually use it back on the job. So it's not just at the end of training can they pass a test saying, yes, I learned the training content. Do they actually take what they learned and use it in their everyday work? This is important because this is the whole point of our training. If we don't get training transfer, we might as well not have had the training at all. And this may seem like a very obvious, very simple point, but you'd be surprised at how many organizations treat training as if, well, training is something that we need to have training. And they don't necessarily think about maximizing training transfer or evaluating whether training transfer happens. From the industrial psychology perspective, though, this is something that's very interesting to us. There are a lot of interesting individual, social, contextual, psychological factors that influence, even if people learned a great deal in training, how likely are they to actually go and use it back on the job? Some of these factors are individual difference factors, differences among trainees. We know, for example, that the people who tend to benefit the most from training are people who have high learning self-efficacy, people who tend to believe that they can learn new things, and who tend to have a mastery goal orientation or a learning goal orientation. This is a difference that's been researched pretty extensively in social psychology. There tend to be people who are performance-oriented, who want to do things well on the first try, who don't like making mistakes, who are very threatened by negative feedback. We say those people have a high performance goal orientation, and there tend to be people who focus more on learning and the process and mastering something. These are people who tend to be much less threatened by failure, who expect to make mistakes, who don't mind so much getting that corrective or constructive feedback. People who are high in these characteristics naturally tend to learn a little bit more from training. They approach training with a more positive attitude. They gain more from the process than people who are low in self-efficacy or who have that performance goal orientation. Now, these are stable individual differences. People have a predisposition to have low or high learning self-efficacy. They have a predisposition toward being more mastery-oriented or more performance-oriented, and those differences tend to be stable across a lot of situations. If we just leave them alone, these are individual differences that people will bring in with them to the training. However, there's also quite a bit of research that suggests they're not totally fixed. In fact, the instructions that we give to trainees or the context we create for the training environment can shift people's learning self-efficacy or their learning goal orientation. Depending on how we frame the training, we can convince people, yes, you're able to learn this material. Lots of people come in being very nervous about this technical content, but they turn out okay. We selected you for a reason. We believe you can do this. Or we can give instructions that really activate that mastery orientation, like telling people up front, this is challenging material, you're probably going to make lots of mistakes at first, we want you to make mistakes, that's okay, you're going to learn more if you make lots of mistakes. Giving instructions like that shifts people a little bit, sets people up to behave more like people who are naturally high in learning self-efficacy or learning goal orientation. So these aren't just things that we're stuck with. They're not just factors that we should make sure we select on to maximize the benefit of training. We can do that to some extent, but we can also shift how these things are perceived by our trainees and nudge them to be a little bit higher in these characteristics, even if that's not their natural default. So there's still things that a trainer has some influence over. Another individual characteristic that makes a difference in training is called metacognitive skills, which is being able to self-assess how well you're learning. Knowing when you're getting it versus being really overconfident that you're getting it when in fact you're not. Again, there are individual differences in these. Some people come in with higher levels of metacognitive skills than others, but there are also things that a trainer can influence. Giving frequent feedback helps people develop metacognitive skills. They now know they've got a way to check whether they're learning, and so over time, their self-assessments of learning get more accurate. There's some research and training that suggests giving people reminders to pause and think about what they're learning, or breaking learning down into smaller chunks and asking people to self-reflect at the end of each chunk. Those kinds of things help people to stop and think about, am I really getting this material, or do I need to go back and ask questions or review it or practice it some more before I move on? So we know that individual differences are important in training, but as training designers or training providers, there are also lots of things you can do to get people to act as if they have those individual characteristics. It's not solely the employee's responsibility here. There are things trainers can do. One thing that your textbook talks about that I want to point out and correct a little bit, your textbook makes reference to differences in learning styles as potentially affecting training effectiveness. Well, as it turns out, the source that your textbook cites comes out pretty strongly in favor of the idea that there is no evidence for differences in learning styles. It's actually based on a fairly recent meta-analysis that looked at training and learning studies across a wide variety of contexts, and across the board, on average, there seems to be no clear effect. We don't seem to be able to measure learning styles accurately. When we do try to measure learning styles, there's no evidence to suggest that different learning styles actually affect what people learn. There's some slight evidence to suggest that learning styles influence what types of training people like or would choose if given the option, but there's no evidence that says they really create differences in learning outcomes. So your textbook gives you the impression that this might be a reasonable line of thought, but in fact the empirical evidence really suggests that that's not true, that there don't seem to be reliable differences in learning styles that we can detect that seem to show any effect. Moving on from the individual differences to the situational factors, start this one out with a question. Under what kinds of conditions would you expect training to be more effective? Well, although we do often conduct training in classrooms away from the job site, it's not because a distraction-free environment makes the training transfer any better. In fact, in study after study, we very consistently find that the more similar we can get the training context to the context of the actual work site, the more easily we expect training to transfer. Formally, this is known as the principle of identical elements. The more aspects of the training you can make similar, the better that training will work in the end. When we talk about similarity, we can think about it in two different ways. We can talk about physical fidelity, or physical similarity. Fidelity is the more formal term, in which we're concerned with having the training look and feel like the job site. So using exactly the same equipment, using the same processes. If you were training people on how to use a cash register, you would want them to have an actual cash register, not a computer screen that kind of simulated that cash register. If you were concerned about having high physical fidelity. If you think about flight simulators, flight simulators are so very expensive because, in part, they're carefully designed to look exactly like the cockpit of a particular airplane. If you were trained on a Boeing 747, you wouldn't necessarily expect that to just automatically transfer over to an Airbus jet. The layout of the cockpit is very different. You would want to have specific simulators that matched each airplane that people would train in so that you'd have that good physical fidelity. The other way that things can be similar or have high fidelity is in terms of psychological fidelity. which means that it requires exactly the same KSAOs or behaviors as the job. If you had a very, very nice, very expensive flight simulator in which everything looked just exactly like the cockpit of the airplane looked, but you knew going in, you can't actually crash this plane, it's not real, nobody's life is depending on you, you're not under any kind of pressure to get anywhere on time, just go play with it and have fun. You would have very high physical fidelity, but you'd have low psychological fidelity because you're missing a lot of the pressures, a lot of the concerns, a lot of the psychological elements that typically go along with flying an airplane under real conditions. So when we talk about having high fidelity in training or having identical elements, physical fidelity alone is sometimes really important, but it's not necessarily enough. Psychological fidelity actually tends to be more important. If you can get psychological fidelity without physical fidelity, sometimes that might be enough. Although for a highly technical job like flying an airplane, that physical fidelity, being able to know just automatically exactly where everything is located, that can be really important too. So we have to think very carefully to what degree are each of these things important and try to match the training to the job in terms of physical elements or psychological elements or both. A related issue here is an idea called transfer through principles. This is the idea that training transfers better if we don't just teach employees what to do or how to do it, but we tell them why they need to do it and when they need to do it. So you can train a sales representative on exactly how to ring in a transaction. But if on the job they come up with a transaction that's not typical, that's not normal, if they haven't been trained on the principles of this is why you go through each of these steps, they may not be able to transfer. They may just panic and say, well, I don't know how to deal with this situation, let me call a manager, when it's actually something that they could logically figure out. The more you explain, the better they'll be able to transfer, even when the situation on the job doesn't look just exactly like the situations that they were trained on. There's another very important aspect of the training context, and that's the idea of transfer climate. Transfer climate isn't something that happens within the training room, it's something that happens when the employee goes back to their supervisor and their work group. Transfer climate refers to the degree to which supervisors and coworkers encourage people to use their training on the job. A poor transfer climate would be one that frankly exists at lots and lots of workplaces where they say, well, yeah, whatever they told you in training, forget it. This is how I want you to do it. Or this is the way we do things around here. When you're faced with a choice between doing it the way you were taught by a trainer that you will never see again, or the way that your supervisor who evaluates your performance and who you see every day wants you to do it, most people are naturally going to go with the way the supervisor wants them to do it, or the way the coworkers encourage them to do it. In fact, a number of studies have suggested that supportive supervisors are one of the very best predictors of transfer of training. And in particular, not just supervisors who are kind of vaguely supportive, who say, yeah, please, go to training and use it, but trainers who provide active support. Specifically, one study found that supervisors who met with their employees before and after training beforehand said, hey, I really want you to get this, this, and this out of the training. It's really important that you learn these things. And then met with them again after and said, hey, how can I help you transfer this training? Let's check in and make sure that you're doing it the way you were trained. Those supervisors actually saw their employees transfer information best and keep using that information the longest. So supervisors play a really important role in supporting transfer of training when the employee gets back to the job. Another contextual factor, partly facilitated by the supervisor, but also by the trainers or the proponents of the training program, is employees' motivation to use the training. The challenge here is that we're concerned with motivation for several different things here. We need motivation to attend the training, to sign up for it in the first place, to actually make it to the training when it actually happens. We want employees to be motivated to perform well in the training, to do their best and put in effort while they're in training itself. And then we want them to be motivated to transfer training back to the job after the end of the training program. Where this gets tricky is that what works to facilitate one of these things doesn't necessarily guarantee any of the others. So for example, we'll start with motivation to attend. Which do you think is more effective in getting people to attend a training program? What we find in the research literature is that just-in-time training that is immediately personally relevant, is much more motivating to attend than training that's just in case, or for something that's in the distant future. I might need that someday isn't nearly as motivating as I need that right now. So when you're talking about retraining, training people for transition to a new equipment or new procedures, it's better to find the sweet spot for that training and deliver that just in time, so that people are going to go to the training and then immediately or very soon be able to go put what they learned into use on the job. Other factors that influence motivation to attend are convincing people that the training is interesting, that it's relevant, that it's very important, even if they're not necessarily going to use it right away. Something like sexual harassment reporting training, you might present that as, hey, this is really critical because a number of our competitors are in the process of lawsuits for this. We need to be sure that even if it's not imminent in your work group, that you know how to handle it if it should arise. Convince employees that it really is critical for them to have this information. It's also helpful to give employees choices. We talked in the previous lecture about getting employees' input on what kinds of training they need or they want. Offering employees a training that they themselves have requested is much more motivating than just being told, hey, we want you to go through this training. Again, though, if you give employees choices, you need to respond to their preferences and follow through and act on the information that they gave you. Although we might like to think that in an ideal world, people would just want to go to training for the sake of learning new things, it does in fact work. It increases motivation to attend if you offer people incentives for completing training. Food is also quite important. People will do a lot of things for a free good meal. So these kinds of practical issues, although they don't necessarily feel as noble as motivation by presenting the training as relevant, they do in fact affect who's going to sign up for training and who's going to show up on the day of. These incentives and perks, though, don't necessarily mean that an employee who shows up for training will be motivated to perform well in training or to transfer their training. One last factor that plays a large role in motivation to attend training are the pressures that someone might experience that make it hard for them to attend training. One of the most common reasons people give for not attending training or not pursuing employee development opportunities is, I have too much other work to do, or my department's understaffed right now. I can't get away. If I get away, it will burden other people in my work group. So sometimes in order to get people to attend training, it's necessary to remove these barriers or these distractions and provide extra support, maybe reduce a person's workload goals, or provide some extra help or some extra staffing to make up for employees who have to attend training and do their jobs at the same time. So all of these things help make employees more motivated to show up for training. They don't necessarily motivate employees to pay attention while they're there. Motivation to perform well in training tends to be motivated not so much by incentives for showing up, but by helping employees see that there's a connection between learning the material, developing their skills, and outcomes that are valuable for them. That doesn't mean you should offer them an incentive of, $50 if you do well on the test at the end of the training. That's not really what you want. You want people to see that what they learn is likely to pay off in big long-term outcomes that are valuable. Hey, you need to develop these skills if you want to be considered. And that does set us up nicely for our next topic, where we will talk about key learning principles, some of which came out of training research, some of which came from broader learning research in cognitive psych, about what actually helps people learn and retain and transfer what they learn in training.